Good morning. We'd like to welcome you on this rainy morning this morning to another sermon from the Gardner Lane Church of Christ. Today I'd like to talk with you for a few moments on the subject of when brethren disappoint us. Or we can look at it from another way, when we disappoint other brethren. We can look at it both ways. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 29 it says, "Who is weak without my being weak? And who is led into sin without my intense concern?" One of the first things we want to see is what causes us to be disappointed with brethren. Or on the flip side, what causes brethren to be disappointed with us. Maybe first of all, we see that they have failed to be examples, or we have failed to be examples. In 2 Corinthians and in chapter 9, and in verses 1 through 4, the Apostle Paul there, he is trying to make sure that the church of Corinth is going to send their contribution to the needy saints back in Judea or to Jerusalem at that time. In chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians, in verse 1 through 4, it says, "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry of the saints, or to the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you, and to the Macedonians, namely, that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has been stirred up, most of them. But I have sent the brethren, in order that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, so that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. Otherwise, if any Macedonians come to me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, will be put to shame by this confidence." He's writing a letter back to the church of Corinth. They haven't followed through yet. We look at Corinth and he's trying to hold them up, as an example during this time. And if you go back on what you said you were going to do, and you choose not to send this contribution, then definitely it's going to be an embarrassment to you, but you can imagine what it's going to do to the relationship between the Jew and the Gentile. Something else we see here is what causes us to be disappointed with brethren. They let us down in time of need, or we've let them down in time of need. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, and in verse 10, we see the Apostle Paul. He's evidently in an inner prison during this time, not like his first arrest where he was under sort of a house arrest at that time. But this time he's basically probably down in some type of a dungeon like. And he knows that he's going to die. And he's trying to put the last things in order, and he talks about a relationship that he has with a man named Demas. And Demas loved this present world, and he left him. And we see that he had been a fellow worker at one time with the Apostle Paul. In Proverbs chapter 25 and in verse 19, Proverbs chapter 25 and in verse 19, Proverbs 25 and verse 19, it says, "Like a bad tooth," you've had that before, "or an unsteady foot." Maybe some of you have even had that. "Like a bad tooth or an unsteady foot is confidence in a faithless man in time of trouble." We understand that hurts us deeply when we're let down in time of need. Or maybe we've let others down. We've disappointed other people in a time of need. Something else we see here is their behavior harms the cause of Christ, or in turn, our behavior can harm the cause of Christ. We see in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, they're taking each other to court. And evidently they're taking each other to court maybe over the simplest matters. And they're airing the church's dirty laundry out in the middle of all these people to see. And this is probably hindering the cause of Christ in many cases. And he tells them in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and in verse 4 through 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and in verses 4 through 7, it says, so that you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them as judges who are of no account in the church? I say this to your shame. It is so, that there are not among you one wise man who is able to decide between his brethren. But brother goes to law with brother, and before unbelievers? Actually then, it is already a defeat for you, that if you have lawsuits with one another, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? Or in Romans chapter 2, and in verses 21 through 24, he basically asks the question, teachest thou not thyself? You say thou shalt not steal. Do you steal? You say thou shalt not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? So we see behavior that harms the cause of Christ. They've not considered others in 1 Corinthians and in chapter 11, as he deals with that of the Lord's Supper in chapter 11. And in verse 20 beginning, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 20, therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one of you takes his own supper first. One is hungry, another is drunk. What then? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? I say to you, what shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. The Lord's Supper had supposed to be a declaration of their unity with Christ. And as we partake the Lord's Supper, our unity with one another. They weren't caring for one another in the body of God. They were taking the Lord's Supper, but at the same time, there were people maybe in poverty. And if you're a unified people, you're going to do something about caring for other people. So what causes people to be disappointed? Well, a lot of times you just haven't considered other people. Or maybe they're disappointed in us, and we haven't considered other people. Or it might be our own self-righteousness. Sometimes we get disappointed in others because we think too much of ourselves. Some who are being successful as Christians look down their noses on people that are struggling. Writer once said there's two enemies in the church, and that's unrighteousness and self-righteousness. Quickly as we go through this, we must see ourselves in our brother. In James 3 and in verse 2 it says, we all stumble in many ways. A lot of people say, being self-righteous, I don't do that. I don't stumble at all in any way. And what you're saying is you're making out God to be a liar. Because he says here in the Bible, James 3 verse 2, we all stumble in many ways. We don't like to see ourselves in that way. We have disappointed. We've disappointed other people. Other people have disappointed us, no doubt. But at the same time, there's been cases to where we have disappointed other people. It should humble us and ease that disappointment that we have, knowing that we were in sin at one time and we had disappointed other people. We must remember our own need for forgiveness. In Matthew chapter 9, it talks about those that are sick with sin, and we need to recognize that. In chapter 21, those who do not see their sin, but they keep on trying to judge others. In John chapter 9, verse 39 through 41, the danger of making a judgment over the fact of who I will be disappointed in. Or in Romans chapter 3, verse 10, verse 23, that all have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. It might be good for us to think about that before we think about that we're disappointed in somebody else, that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Well, the last 2 points here, and that is that we have sympathy and we have compassion for our brethren. The last part of both those words, sympathy and compassion, comes from the same Greek root, meaning pathos, that you have feeling. You have feeling for your brethren. And be willing to do whatever is necessary to help them. In 2 Corinthians and in chapter 12, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and in verse 20, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and in verse 20, it says, "For I am afraid that perhaps when I come, I may find you to be not what I wish, and may be found by you to be not what you wish." What are we going to do when we have to confront other people that are disappointed? Maybe they're disappointed in us. Maybe we're disappointed in them. We would say, "Oh, well, I tell you what, I'm going to go to them. I'm going to straighten those people out." Well, the Apostle Paul writes concerning this, saying, well, perhaps there's going to be strife. We don't want that. Perhaps there's going to be jealousy. There's going to be angry tempers, the Apostle Paul says. Disputes, slanders. Maybe you're going to gossip about the other people, or the other people are going to gossip about you. We don't want that. We don't need that. We need to be concerned about each other as we make our way to heaven. We appreciate you tuning in today, and until next week, we bid you a very pleasant